Brains in Motion with Mary McCone, Ed D, and Angela Zielinski, DPT. Please remember that this podcast is for educational purposes only. This is not medical advice, and this is just general discussion for educational purposes. Thank you. Enjoy! A note for these first couple episodes. We are excited to share this project with you, but remember, we are still learning, and please be kind. Thank you. Welcome back, Mary, to our second episode. We have titled it Reflexes, Building the Foundation for Sensory Processing and Movement. Welcome.
Thanks, Angela. It's so good to be back. I'm excited to bring our listeners into this portion of our conversation.
The first episode, we talked a lot about reflex integration. What is a reflex? Just in case you didn't listen, we wanted to give you a quick overview. So, Mary, what are reflexes? What's our elevator pitch for what's a reflex?
Well, reflexes are a series of movements that babies go through starting in utero through the age of 3 is when the last ones kind of disappear or integrate, we say, and they are innate. They're DNA encoded. Like I said, they emerge in utero as early as 12 weeks gestation, and they begin developing the vestibular and vestibular system and movement patterns even before birth. They facilitate the birth process, and then initially they provide protection for the infant those first few months of life to keep the small human alive. And they do so many things for that developing baby, which we're going to talk about 2 of those things today, which is very exciting.
It is, and it's so incredible to think about that these reflexes are starting in utero. The birth process definitely starts off the biggest cascade, but they're developing all of these pieces even before they're born. So that's why I find the reflex integration works so well, is because our bodies have been using them from the beginning, right?
Right. Yeah. And there's still this real misunderstanding about what reflexes are. And I know we're going to talk more about that. And kind of the next thought is everybody's heard of primitive reflexes. And just as a review, because we talked about that last time, primitive reflex means it's present at birth and it has a response to stimulus. So, those first 3 months of life, babies are only responding to the environment. They don't move on their own because they see something or they want something or they want to hug somebody, right? I mean, maybe you could speak to that a little bit more.
No, right. So primitive is that very first stage of reflex development. What's hard is that reflexes actually mature as babies mature and as our nervous system matures. And so they are supposed to change and not stay in that primitive state. And like you spoke to before, is if they're in that primitive state, that means your nervous system isn't ready to change and develop, and you can't keep integrating if you stay in the primitive space. So we want to help those ones that are classified as primitive move into primary reflexes, which means that the stimulus has changed. And Dr. Maskatova has done a lot of work on the different sensory fields of primitive versus primary and the responses that you get. And there's also different types of reflexes besides just primitive, even though they all get lumped together, right, Mary?
Yeah.
There are postural reflexes, there are writing reactions, and I see you've got listed lifelong reflexes as well. Do you want to speak a little bit, how are they different?
So that they just have different functions, right? Each set of them takes the baby to a new level of development. So
I like that.
So the primitive reflexes are really about birth and early survival. And then when the sensory response goes away, and a good example of that would be Babinski. That's one that they check in the hospital before your baby gets to go home. And if you stroke the side of the foot from the bottom to the top by the below the small toe. The big toe goes up, the little toes go down, and then the foot will turn towards the midline of the body. That's the Babinski reflex, and it's a sensory response. Or if you push into the middle of a baby's hand, their mouth will open. That's Babkin. But when it begins to mature, you could do that sensory input and you won't see that response. Now we know that we're not just responding to sensory input. Now the brain is making decisions about how to move. Now the prefrontal cortex is involved, motor cortex, basal ganglia, and now it's a primary reflex. So those do we'll get, that's the whole thing today is about what else do they do, so we'll dig into that. But then postural reflexes are, how do babies start to crawl, how do they get up on all fours, which is called creeping, in Europe, and then how do they get to walking, how do they maintain their posture to sit up straight. Those are postural reflexes. And then the writing reflexes is how do we keep ourselves from like falling over, I guess would be the easiest way to say it, right?
Mhm.
So like if we tilt our bodies to one side, our head will tilt to the other side to right ourselves because our vestibular system is saying, hey, my human's going to fall over. I've got to tilt myself. And you see that start to degrade in older people, elderly people. It's one of the things that makes them a fall risk, actually, is their writing reflexes start to degrade as their vestibular system starts to degrade with age. And so it impacts their posture. They're all tied together. And then lifelong reflexes are things like the gag reflex is a lifelong reflex, and it's not developmental. So we're not going to talk about that. It's not like the gag reflex isn't responsible for brain development. It's like a innate response to
Just
keep us from dying, basically.
there's so many different types of reflexes, which is how it can get confusing and how we just have to be careful with the words that we
Mhm.
choose. And sometimes things just get all lumped together, right?
Right. Well, that's why I call them neuro reflexes, because that encompasses all of them. Because
Ah,
you can have primitive reflexes and postural reflexes present at the same time.
mhm.
There's overlap, and some primitive reflexes also have a postural feature to them. So it can get really confusing for people. So if we kind of look at them as neuro reflexes, and that gives us kind of a bucket to put them in. But they also have their own categories.
They do. And I might jump around a little bit because the neuro reflexes is interesting. And one of the topics we wanted to talk about was how are they related neurologically? And the thing that I think is so interesting and fascinating that is we all develop in utero and we have these different layers that develop. And one of the coolest things that I found when I was just looking at different research and looking at like my own, how do these work? Like how are they so interconnected? And one of the cool things is you have these layers as you're developing in utero, and one layer is the ectoderm layer. And this layer is a layer that is developing not only your nervous system, but your skin. So that's how your skin and your sensory system and your nervous system are so linked, is because as you were developing in utero, that layer was connected and then differentiated. Isn't that
Wow.
wild? Like
That is wild.
it's just this
Uh-huh.
simple, like you were created that way. Like this layer was connected and then differentiated. And that's happening way before anything else. Like I just thought that was so
Right.
fascinating.
That is amazing. That reminds me of when I learned that the big toe is connected to the tongue, the back of the tongue.
Ah, yeah.
I was like, what? So in Babinski, when babies are belly crawling and they're pushing off with their big toe in that commando crawl, when do babies start babbling? Right about after that stage. So it's almost like uh, we were designed so that that crawling stage is what activated the nerves and the muscles that control the tongue, but they're connected through the system of fascia that runs all the way through the body. And I'll bet it goes back to that ectoderm layer. I don't know because that's not that particular piece of information is not my area of expertise, but
It's just so and so, what's also interesting, Mary, is not just like the babbling and the crawling, but walking and talking. That
yes.
often goes together. And so that's often when parents see a delay in walking, there's often a delay in babbling and or talking or words, and they tend to kind of come together, right?
Hmm.
So when speech therapists say, "Why are you working on the feet to help with speech?" Often it's because developmentally they come together. Not
Yes.
always, and sometimes there's blockages or there's things that aren't working together as nicely as we would like, but that's our problem solving is like, oh, let's start because these are linked not only developmentally but
Hmm.
neurologically too. It's just
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
interesting.
But even as an adult, right? Like when I was still, working on a doctorate, if I was stuck on how to frame something, I'd go take a walk and talk it out because the walking like activated the expressive language for me. And I know that happens for other people. You get stuck, you go take a run. I am not a runner. So walking is my thing. But yeah, so it still holds true for adults. Yeah. Um, what else about that? How else are they related neurologically?
Well, we've got neurotransmitters. So there's signals in your body. There's all of these different chemicals get released. And so what reflex pathways do is they help with the regulation of those neurotransmitters. There's also neurons and spinal tracts and cranial nerves. And there's all of these big words that your nervous system encompasses. And reflexes connect all of them. And one of the things I felt like I didn't do a good job of the first one, see, I feel like this podcast is helping us all grow, including me, was I felt like I didn't have a good verbiage of what integration meant, and I found it. So I would love to share it with you
Yeah.
of like reflex integration. The word integration itself is combining different systems into a cohesive whole that works together.
Oh,
So
so like synthesis.
yes. And so reflex integration is combining different systems of the body, nervous system, muscle systems, sensory systems, and my mind energy systems into a cohesive whole, which would be body, brain, spirit that works together seamlessly.
That's
And it's
beautiful.
isn't that like a cool like that seamlessly word of like that's how reflexes bring you all together and can help with so many systems and how they're the foundation because it touches every single system in our body. But it also is why reflex integration can be difficult because if any part of that is off, it can affect the integration of the reflex. So
Yeah,
one looping into the other. So
absolutely. Yeah, I'm always taking classes even though I've been doing this for 20 years cuz there's always new knowledge. So I literally just finished this course on the vestibular system with somebody in Europe and it was fantastic. And we we were discussing the vestibular spinal tract, right? And one of the main reflexes that develops that is spinal galant.
ah,
So when kids are really struggling, oh, and tonic labyrinthine reflex. So when kids are struggling with proprioception, vestibular, like, kids who are always in motion or fall into things or need deep pressure or have attentional issues, that's oftentimes vestibular and proprioception, which is cerebellum. But there are reflexes involved in developing the vestibular spinal tract, which runs right up those deep muscles um, next either side of the spinal cord, the vertebrae there. So yeah, that's one. And then like cranial nerves, um, like one of the best examples I can think of is that the vestibular system, the vestibular nerve and the auditory nerve actually join and become the eighth cranial nerve. And so when we work on reflexes that work on both of those, say 18 hours, the one we always think of for auditory, although other things are involved, and we work on vestibular like TLR and Landau and spinal galant, we're actually working on both of those processing systems that join and become the eighth cranial nerve. Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible, right? Like
Right. Right.
the specifics of it. And those nerves use neurotransmitters to communicate. And
Right.
those nerves use have to be myelinated and they have to process in the brain, which means the brain has to be able to process the information and then it has to go back down. Like
Right.
that's incredible. Like that's
Yeah.
it's so it's just so wild to me. I don't know.
Yeah. No, it is to me too. I know we're both very passionate about this work. So, one thing that, Dr. Muscatova always says is that reflexes are the missing link. What does that mean to you?
To me, it means so there's in physical therapy, what I feel like for especially for pediatric physical therapy, it was
Mhm.
assess the situation and then create the environment for movement to be able to facilitate development. So if you're having trouble with standing, let's say, I'm going to create an environment to give you the building blocks of standing. So maybe we'll do some tall kneeling at a block. Maybe we'll do some cruising at a couch and we'll do some rotating. So helping parents and the kids create the environment to move. But it was always kind of hard because I can create the environment, but I didn't feel like I was changing the system. So for some kids, changing the environment was helpful because they just didn't have the opportunity. For some kids, you can give them that opportunity and they still don't know what to do, or it's still really hard for them. And I felt like I didn't have the piece of like, how do I change your internal system so that it's easier to navigate this new environment? And that's where
Oh,
reflex integration came in for me.
I have a great example of this.
Please, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I've been working with a child who is a non-fatal drowning, and it was 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and they have been in, PT and OT, and this family has done everything. They're the most amazing people I think I've ever met, and then I came in to be part of the team, and we work remotely, and we've been working together, I think, about 9 months, and we've hit this point now that because, like you said, we've created these pathways that all of a sudden, all the other things that they're doing where they're creating these opportunities, all of a sudden she's exploded. She started feeding herself and she can now sit up for up to 2 minutes and she's starting to take steps in a trainer. Like
It's
n-
amazing.
none of those things were 9 months ago. And I'm just one member of a very large team of people, but I sincerely believe that it was the missing link of creating those pathways so that the brain could receive therapy. And you have to have the framework there in place so that your body can receive the therapy and use it. And that's kind of how I think of some of this work in reflexes is we're creating pathways so that the brain can take in the information and process it the way that it was supposed to. And it is that link. It's the link between the body and the brain and the brain and the body and the sensory systems and the fascia and all the things that you were talking about and this very, very complex system that we have. And one of the most common questions I get on my Facebook group is, what is the reflex that's responsible for fill in the blank?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
Speech, walking, rolling over. You can just fill that in because I get that question a lot. And like you said, it's never just one
Mm-hmm.
reflex, right?
Right.
Because they work in sync. They're synthesized, right? And
Yes.
they all work together in harmony to bring things along. And so that's one of the biggest things I hope people learn from our podcast is it's very complex and working with someone who's really well trained is very important. And there isn't one thing that does one thing. Like I think our culture in general is a very like diagnosis driven culture. So I have this problem and this is the way you solve it. You do this one thing and I'll make it better. And that really is not how the human body works at all.
No.
Right.
There's many things that work on each of these systems individually. So like PT is really good at like a motor system. and their OT is what we historically think of for the sensory system. And we put these things in boxes, right? But reflex integration is one of the only things that uses all the systems at once. So that's why in the first episode, when I said everything is reflex integration in a way, because anything that's working on any of these systems is helping each system fire individually, which then will help with the integration. But using the reflex and using this biological pathway that's been laid down in utero helps the body be like, oh, I remember this. I can now connect all these systems and then move out of it. And it's
Yeah.
just like this nice reminder. And reflex integration is one of the only things that I've found that links all of the systems at once.
Mhm. Mhm. And I think too that people get confused about this idea of like integration. I think the way you defined it was so good, but like I have a kiddo right now, is 3 months old. I'm working with a sibling, really, and then this kiddo was just born, but the spinal galant isn't even present on one side.
Hmm.
So, like, it didn't emerge, right? And
Hmm.
18R is only present on one side. It
Hmm.
didn't emerge. A little bit of a complicated birth there, so it's not unusual.
Hmm.
But you can't integrate something that didn't emerge.
Yes.
So, in a lot of practices that I've seen, that step is skipped. Is it present? Was it present? Because in order to integrate something and to finish a pathway, you have to make sure that the connection was made to begin with. So, in my practice, when I work with medically complicated kids, which is a lot of them, honestly, right now, um, I always go through an activation first. Like, let's make sure that that was activated on both sides first. And then we can work on maturing it and getting past the sensory stimulus. And then we can work on the motor, which gets us into integration. So it really is a very complicated little pathway that we go through. But I just wanted our listeners to know that sometimes, like kids with CP or stroke in utero or kids who are hypoxic, may not even have some of the reflexes come on like the way they were supposed to. So you can't integrate something that isn't present. So you may have to activate it first, which is a whole different topic. Like, yeah,
No,
so, but
that's a great
for today, I think we were going to get into sensory
point.
processing.
Well,
So I'll just make that transition for us.
this is great because sensory processing to me is working with your nervous system and your sensory system to regulate. And if you don't have sensory regulation, then I might touch something or I might encounter something. And then the way I process that information is either too high or too low. And reflexes can help bridge that regulation. Um, and
Yeah.
it,
So let's dig into that a little bit, shall we?
sure. Um,
Yeah.
one of the most common things that I see and that I felt in myself was I could not sit still. I was somebody who would bounce my feet constantly. I would be up, I would be down. I didn't even, I was doing it to a level that like everybody noticed, right? Everybody be like, Ange cannot sit still. I went 30 plus years not being able to sit still. And then I started doing this work and we would go to classes and then like coworkers would work on you because you got to practice. And there was a day after one class where I just sat still the next day. And it was wild, Mary. Like I've never sat still. And my foot reflexes, I felt grounded, like connected to the earth.
Yeah.
And I think about
Yeah.
that a lot in terms of sensory, of I could not have people touch my feet. We've talked about that before, but I was also a bouncer, a mover. I needed to know where I was in space because my body just wasn't firing correctly. And just integrating my foot reflexes helped me ground and helped me be able to sit still and then process information.
Hmm.
Isn't that crazy?
Yes and no, because the foot
That's right.
reflex, right?
Right.
Because the foot reflexes are so involved in our vestibular system, actually, right? And
Hmm.
being grounded and knowing where the bottom of our body is. Like, oh, there's the bottom. And now that I know where the bottom is, I can start to feel where the rest of me is. And I can right myself over that bottom. But if I don't
Yeah.
know where the bottom is, right? So this is something that people often tell me on our first call, we do our intake. My child never sits still. They're always in motion. And that often gets diagnosed as ADHD,
Hmm.
or that the child's in fight or flight.
Hmm.
And although the autonomic nervous system can be involved because of that, which we could talk about, I think it's important. I think we were going to talk about vagus nerve in a little bit, but it's really about proprioception and vestibular. Like you said, you didn't know where your body was. So the first two senses that develop are proprioception and vestibular. So you want to talk a little bit more about what proprioception is? Because most people say where your body is in space, and it is way more than that.
Tell me more.
So we have like 7 types of proprioceptors. So they tell us about the movement of our muscles and how flexed and contracted they are. We even have proprioceptors in our hair follicles, and they kind of act like little antenna to like, oh, where are we going? And I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure they're related to the writing reflexes of our head. But I haven't read any research on that, but it makes sense to me. Um, so we have ones that tell us about pressure and pain and temperature and movement, and they're constantly talking to the brain and receiving information back and forth, back and forth. So you have them in your muscles, like your muscle spindle cells, you have them in your joints, like the Golgi tendon bodies, and there's mechanoreceptors and corpuscles and all kinds of things we don't need to get into, but they're constantly feeding information to the brain about where you are, how flexed and extended your muscles are, so that when you do want to do something, that you can coordinate that movement. That is a direct reflection of proprioception and action, that we can regulate our own bodies, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. And also, do I know where I am in space? So do I know where my body ends and the rest of the world begins? Like, kids are always falling into things or falling off their chair, or kids who are throwing themselves onto things all the time. Their proprioception is underdeveloped, and they literally are trying to figure out where their own body is. Yeah.
Yeah, and everybody agrees with that explanation. Like we learn in PT school all about the different receptors and how to activate them and how to use them in different movements. So my question to you is, how is quote in quotes reflex integration or reflexes
Mhm.
helping this system differently or more than others?
Hmm. Well, you're both a PT and a reflex integration specialist, so this might be your question. Um, I'm an educator and a reflex integration specialist. But when we do reflex work, there's a passive portion where we're moving the body, and then there's an active portion, and we're giving input, and kids are like pressing against us, like we're giving some resistance. I know Dr. Barnes Heath calls it like disruptive pattern, right? So like,
Mm-hmm.
here's the passive pattern, and then I'm gonna like say that we're working on plantar, and the child is flexing their foot down, and I might provide them some resistance, and they're gonna push into my hand. When that happens, we're activating those proprioceptors to communicate back with the basal ganglia, sensory motor cortex, and then the prefrontal cortex gets involved to motor plan that push. And so we're developing stronger connections between the proprioceptors, basal ganglia, sensory motor cortex, and prefrontal cortex.
I like that. And that helped me because I wasn't sure where I was going to go with it, Mary, was you're right. It's the passive piece because a lot of what MNRI does and a lot of what other people do regular PTs will do, like you said, like the alternating interruptions is what they will call it. There's a lot of isometrics. There's a lot of what PTs would call PNF patterns. But the difference with at least the type of reflex integration we do is we use the passive portion of a reflex to show the body
Yeah.
this is how it's supposed to go. This is how it's supposed to feel. And if you're doing it correctly, you're showing the body that that pathway is safe
Yes.
repeatedly, because
Yes.
something may have happened in that pathway. Like, let's say we're still talking about feet, multiple ankle injuries in my case, from sports and from being there. So you would think that things are working fine because I've rehabbed it and I'm a PT, but my body was always looking for danger until I did reflex integration, because I was passively shown, hey, sensory system, remember these points, remember this pathway. This pathway is safe. Do it with me. You do it passively and then actively, and then you're supposed to be able to move through those steps like we've talked about, where passive, active, resisted, and then freedom of movement, right? And if you skip that passive step, I feel like bodies compensate really well,
Yes.
but they don't actually believe you. So they kind of stay on high alert, would be the way that I would describe it.
Right. So about 10 times a week, I ask people, please stay off the YouTube videos. Although Dr. Heath does have a YouTube channel that's fantastic, but other than that, stay off the YouTube videos of like people just showing you these things you could do at home for reflexes, because they're all active. And do we know? Do we know that the sensory piece has been addressed? Do we know that the passive piece has been addressed? So if the body doesn't know that pattern and we're just teaching a skill, skills are neocortex, but we may not have the pathway there, and the brain may not perceive that that movement pattern is safe for them because it's not fully developed. So they'll compensate. Exactly what you said. Compensation's such a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
bodies are smart, right? Like they're gonna figure out how
right,
to do it, whether it's comfortable or whether it's like in quotes, like the correct pathway. Bodies are gonna do stuff, um,
right. Yeah.
because they want to stay regulated the best way they know how. They don't know that they're off. They don't know that they're firing too high or that they're still in danger. They're just trying to protect us. They're just trying to maintain
Right.
homeostasis, right?
Right.
Um,
And proprioception's so involved in the feeling of safety and keeping our autonomic nervous system in parasympathetic. So that's why you hug your baby and hold them when they're upset. It's the touch and the squeezes that calm the nervous system. I mean, as an infant, it's also mom's smell and mom's skin and mom's heartbeat. But even a small child, even, if your friend's upset and you're like, can I give you a hug? It's the proprioceptive input that says, you know what, brain, you're okay. You're okay. So it's integrally tied to the vagus nerve, which regulates your autonomic nervous system. And so when kids are always in an elevated state, and people often call that moro, when they're in this elevated sympathetic state, it's oftentimes proprioceptive and vestibular is the culprit. The brain doesn't feel safe because it doesn't know where it is, and it can't regulate movement and adjust to keep itself safe in a fluid and symmetrical, easy kind of way. It's a struggle. They're putting a lot of effort into just maintaining that.
The
Yeah.
effort piece, you're right, like the
Yeah.
effort to maintain, and when your vagus nerve isn't regulated, you have effort to breathe, you have effort to pay
Di-
attention, right?
di-
Digest.
digest,
Yeah.
right?
And so,
How
but
common are digestive issues in the kids we work with,
yeah, but if your
right?
vagus nerve is on point and regulated, it's easier to breathe. It's easier to stay calm because everything is working. And again, it kind of comes back to, for me, the connection piece
Yeah.
of it just connects so many different pieces in so many ways, which is super cool.
Hmm.
And it also connects movement. So we've been talking a lot about safety and like where we are in space, right? And we're talking about it from a sensory standpoint. And many people don't realize that proprioception and vestibular are part of the sensory system, which then help the movement system.
Yes.
Um, they're
Right.
all so coordinated, and you can't really do one without the other. You need them all
Mm-hmm.
to know where you are in space, to make movements,
Mm-hmm.
to go where you're going. I don't.
Right. No, no, no. I know what you mean. And I think the other thing, a lot of clients, almost all of my clients, when they come to me, they're like, "Oh, my child has hypotonia." Primarily, that is a proprioceptive issue. That the proprioceptors are not receiving or giving the correct information about how flexed or extended the muscles are. But the hypotonia, the low tone, is such a common thing. And as we work through the reflex patterns, and particularly we get through those postural reflexes, all of a sudden the low tone is gone
Ah,
be- because the proprioceptors are giving and receiving the correct information. And it's like, oh, okay, I know how to keep myself upright. That's amazing. Thank you.
that's a great point. So as your nervous system improves, as the reflexes improve, you said that they start to fire correctly and they get more better information. And you've used this before, like the pathway becomes more myelinated, so it becomes more
Yes.
efficient, so the body doesn't have to work as hard. And everything comes down to using these pathways to not have to work as hard and to not fight your own body and to have freedom of movement.
So, what's the connection then between proprioception and vestibular?
I feel like you have a scientific answer that I would like to hear. Please tell me.
She's like, and back to you in the studio.
And you.
Well, no, I wasn't gonna go all sciency on you, although I mean, I am kind of nerdy, so okay. But well, the proprioception and vestibular systems have to work together constantly all day long. Even when you're sleeping, they're talking to each other. So the vestibular system, you have several mechanisms for vestibular, like your otoliths and semicircular canals that are constantly reading how your body is moving. A lot through head movement as to what's going on. And then they're talking to the proprioceptors about how to adjust the muscles to accomplish that. So, for example, if I was to lean my body to the left, those little mechanisms are like, whoa, 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 Mary's leaning to the left. Okay, muscles on the left side, flex. Muscles on the right side, extend. Wonder Twin powers activate. And that's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
If you're not over 40, you probably don't know who the Wonder Twins are, but they were a big deal in the 70s. I'm just saying. So, and that's what keeps me from falling over is those two mechanisms have to work together. We call that sensory integration. The two sensory systems are working together, and they're both the vestibular and proprioceptive neurons are both in midline cerebellum, so they're even regulated in the same part of the brain. So there's your sciencey stuff for you. So when we're working on passive movement and doing proprioceptive input, we are directly targeting that part of the brain. But like even if I was going to catch a ball, right, I've got to put my arm out, my eyes have to see it. Vestibular and ocular are very tied together. We could talk about that shortly. And then I have to make all these adjustments in my body to make that happen without falling over and to accurately catch that ball and bring it back. And that is evidence of those two systems working together
In coordination with the movement
in,
system, right?
in coordination with the movement system. Without proprioception and vestibular, there is no coordinated movement.
Ooh, that makes them that's why linking them can be so helpful in
Mm-hmm.
improving quality of movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the things as a PT. I feel like we talked a lot in school about looking at movement and looking at it from a lens of like this muscle is weak or this nerve isn't working, or looking at it from those systems, not looking at it from like a receptor information processing system.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that has really, reflex integration has really helped me look at quality of movement. What does a movement look like versus, oh, it's happening and these muscles are just weak. So if we strengthen those muscles, the quality will improve. That's not necessarily true. What I have found to help the best quality of movement or how something looks and be in alignment and ease of movement has been reflex integration.
Yep. I was just talking to a new client the other day, and we were having our initial intake, and she said, I asked him, how does it look when they walk and when they run? Because this kiddo is like 5, and they said, well, it looks okay, but it just seems like it takes a lot of effort, and they
Mm,
wear out. They wear out really quickly. And other kids their age, they can run for days. And I look at them and it looks like they are just putting a lot of effort into moving.
mhm,
And then oftentimes when people will send me videos, I'll ask them like, send me a video of them running around at the park or whatever. And I look at it and what I see is the kid slightly tilting to left and one foot is turned in. And when they run, their arms might be kind of up, kind of like wing position. And yes, they're moving through space, but is it coordinated? Is it symmetrical? Is it effortless?
mhm,
Usually the answer to that is no. And it's because the vestibular proprioceptive systems are not coordinated and we still have retained reflexes. So we don't have the correct pathways, we don't have the right muscle activation. And the sensory system gives that information to our muscles to do their job. So in our kind of segmented society where this kind of person does this work and this kind of
mhm.
person does this work,
Yeah.
right? You could have a kid who has, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, ADHD, autism, a sensory processing disorder, because they've seen all these different people and they've given them all these different diagnoses. But really, what does that come back to? It comes back to immature pathways in the brain, a lack of development in the sensory system, i.e., retained reflexes or underdeveloped reflex patterns.
Yeah, which is why, again, goes back to that missing link piece of, like you said, the segmentation of society. We all look at just kind of one portion when really it's that these are all connected by this underlying pathway, or not on multiple underlying pathways. Excuse me. Infant point of view is a lot of people know that when kids are starting to cruise, which is standing and their hands are like going along a couch, so you're moving side to side, that they're supposed to be a little wobbly, that it's gonna look a little, you know, it's not going to look like walking yet because they're unstable and they're learning. But one of the things I will tell people to look for is, do they cruise both directions along a couch? Because kids and bodies are really good at compensating. And sometimes what
Yeah.
they'll do is they'll turn around and use a different surface. And they're always cruising to the right because the right side, whether for whatever reason, is firing differently easier than the left
Uh-huh.
side. So it's that
Uh-huh.
same conversation of, you can have the environment, but if the system isn't working or isn't introduced to a different way, they will compensate and just go the way that's comfortable. But with reflex integration and education, you can invite that left side to be on board and remind parents to create an environment where they're going both directions and development gets back on track.
Right. It's one of the things I always ask people. Did your child roll? Did they roll to both sides?
Both
Right.
sides, yes.
And usually the answer is no. And when they crawled on their belly, did they use both legs or did they kind of drag one leg? And almost always the answer is, oh, yeah, they drug their right leg. I just thought it was cute,
Right, that or
right?
butt scoot, or they skipped crawling, or
Right.
they didn't like
Right.
crawling, I feel like. But you're right, that goes back to that quality of movement piece, right? Why I love working with infants is, if you can catch that at an infant level and help
Mhm.
it be more symmetrical when it's supposed to be coming online,
Yeah.
then their development just goes off and you might not ever see me again. Whereas
Right.
if they
Right. No.
see that at 8, 9, 10, we got some work to do because it's been doing that for 8, 9, 10 years.
Right? Well, you collaborated with me. You sat in on a session with an infant I was working with in another state, and she wasn't crawling yet, right? And so we did some intervention. We worked together for a couple months, and then she was caught up and off she went. She at that age, it's just a little bit of tweak, tweak, tweak. I call them glitches in the matrix. And then their brain's like, "Oh, I know this pattern. It's my DNA. Thanks. I just had a little hitch in my giddy. Thanks so much."
Yeah.
So we talked about proprioception and vestibular, and those are the foundation, and those develop first. A brand new baby can barely see and barely hear. During the birth process, if they're a traditional vaginal birth and they were not a planned C-section and they got all the contractions and moving through the birth canal, proprioception is activated
Hmm.
for survival outside the uterus. So a lot of babies, well, all but like 3 kids I have right now in my caseload were C-sections, emergency C-sections, planned C-sections. So their proprioceptive system is not developed as well as it should at birth. And then there's the ultra preemies, and that's a whole different class. So when kiddos are born at 27, 28 weeks, their proprioception wasn't even finished developing yet before they left the womb,
Right.
right?
Right.
So this is one of those all approaches are not created equal, and that birth history matters when you're working with kiddos, and so they need a lot of work in proprioception because it was so underdeveloped. The rest of the sensory system is going to have a hard time developing correctly. And what we almost always see then is significant auditory processing deficits, lots of issues with eye teaming and tracking and visual processing, because the two systems that are connected to them, proprioception and vestibular, are underdeveloped. So, how are proprioception and vestibular connected to auditory and visual?
Oh man, great question, Mary. Again, I know you have a science answer. In my mind, the knowledge that I have off the top of my head without like looking at anything is the way proprioception and vestibular are connected to auditory and visual. I think of as reflexes. So
Yep.
STNR, TLR, ATNR. And the easiest for me to explain would be ATNR, because if I turn my head, that's a proprioception and vestibular input. I'm going to then look at an object, which is then vision. And then ATNR is also tied to auditory because my ears, part of my head, that whole system, right, is turning.
When we turn our head and we have one ear up, we're processing sound through that ear. And when we turn our head the other way, we're processing sound through that ear. And my best friend is an audiologist and has been for 60 years. And so I know that we process things differently in the left ear and the right ear.
So yeah, that's the other piece. Yes. And so there's different inputs on that. And so that's how I think of proprioception and auditory visual, is linking that ATNR system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of it from the lens of, for me personally, I am asymmetrical. So I know that if I'm going to a continuing ed class, I have to sit on the right side of the classroom to be able to process information. And if I sit on,
Me too.
yeah, and if I
Yeah.
sit on the left side of that class, I am checked out, and I don't mean to be. I am trying so hard to listen, but I just don't retain the information. So
That
that's
is me too. I
that's you
always sit
too.
on the right side. That's probably why we've sat next to each other.
That's probably why we end up sitting there. Like, I gotta be on that side, so I'm activating my pathways that are more on board. But tell me the science reason that proprioception and auditory and visual systems are linked.
Okay. So I think what you said about the proprioception part is perfect. As far as vestibular, our vestibular and ocular systems are completely tied together through the vestibular, ocular, and ocular vestibular reflexes. Our vestibular and ocular system work together all day long. So, like people who get car sick, it's because of their vestibular ocular reflex. that those two systems have not integrated well. It's also really common in reading issues because when we have to sit still, right? So we need
Mhm. Mhm.
proprioception and vestibular to sit in the chair, and then our eyes are moving across the page. But if those systems haven't integrated, I cannot do that. So I may turn my body to the side and prop my head up on my arm. So I'm using side vision to read because my eyes cannot track and move. They have to stay still in order to read well, right? So
Yes, yes,
the
you need postural support for your
yes,
vision to track. Yes.
yes, right?
Yes.
And spatial awareness is also dependent on that vestibular ocular reflex and those systems working together. If I don't know where I am, I can't then perceive where other things are, spatial awareness using my vision system, right?
Yes.
And then for vestibular and auditory, those two systems join and become the eighth cranial nerve. I mentioned that earlier. That is how
Mhm.
tied together they are. So, like when I was a reading specialist back in the day, when I learned that little trick about 20 years ago that they join and become the eighth cranial nerve, and I thought, huh, I wonder, I wonder if I could use balance as a way to activate the auditory nerve in my non-reading high school students. I don't know. Let's see. So I bought a bunch of balance boards and I had primarily boys in my class. Out of 35 kids, I might have 32 boys. So I'd take a group outside and my aide would stay. I had a co-teacher, he'd stay in the class and we'd go outside and we'd do balance activities. And I'm telling you, it was like the 3rd day of integrated balance activities in that kids started being able to hear and isolate sounds for the first time in their lives. And I just went,
So
is
cool.
what is this madness? Like,
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
how is yeah, like that is how tied together they are. So if we have deficits in these, I call them the lower senses, proprioception and vestibular, because they're regulated mostly in the lower part of the brain and cerebellum, we are also going to have significant issues with our auditory and visual processing. It,
So and then reading and learning, and like you said, that made me think of, so in my first education is I was gonna be a physical education teacher, and so I have yeah, I've got a
I
degree in
didn't know that.
health and human kinetics and education was my bachelor's degree. And one of the things they talk about and there's programs for is how rhythm
Oh, yeah.
helps, right? Rhythm and music helps with things like reading and proprioception and all these things, which is why there's supposed to be a dance section. There's supposed to be a rhythm section. And that's why with like the phasing out of PE and like the changes, you're not getting as much of those fun important inputs as you used to, which then can lead to,
Mhm.
different developmental issues and it can like reading. And that was just one of the, when you said that, it reminded me of like rhythm and dance help with proprioception, vestibular, which then helps with auditory and visual, which then helps
Right?
with reading, learning. And it's just also interesting.
Well, and language itself is based on rhythm. Brain waves are based on rhythm, right?
So
So
cool.
one of that is another I don't know, I just figured this out on my own, like, 15 years ago. I was in my classroom, and I had these kids that would, like, just read as fast as they could, and they couldn't slow down, and I thought, "I wonder if I made them read, like, to something timed, if they would, like, slow down." So, I got a metronome. This was
Mm.
before we had apps. We didn't have apps then, I'm, old, so, we didn't have metronome apps, so I bought a metronome, and I'd have them read their, like, fluency builders to the beat of metronome, and that made a remarkable difference. It actually improved their reading fluency. Well, why? Well, now I know. Now I know.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
That rhythmic activities like rhythmic movements through RMT or interactive metronome is a great one, or playing an instrument or dance or singing. Anything that involves rhythm helps activate the midline cerebellum where our vestibular and proprioceptive neurons are housed. Da ding!
Oh, wow.
What? I know, it's so crazy. Um,
So cool.
What if we talk about a few reflexes that are like really involved in developing the sensory system? What comes to mind when you think like if I had to like I have a preferred place I start, but what would you think, oh, this reflex really is involved in developing this part of the sensory system? What would come to mind for you?
I don't organize that way. So it's a hard I organize based off of movement patterns,
Yeah.
just because that's my background, and then also feel. But, however, that being said, I start at the 2 Babinski points on the feet.
There you go.
That
Feet.
is I've never
Mhm.
started anywhere else, and that is the most regulating, safest point for me personally and for
Mm,
anybody I've ever encountered.
mm.
So for me, I start at the feet on the Babinski points before I even knew they were Babinski points, which is, I think, so fascinating how you can just intuitively feel as well as like the body will tell you, right? So that's my
Yeah.
answer. How about you?
Well, you mentioned this earlier about hands, mouth, and feet, right? That they're all connected. And um, Dr. Barnes Heath calls those the sensory reflexes because if you think of a brand new baby, how do they experience the world
Yeah,
besides touching mom? Hands, mouth, and feet,
hands, mouth.
right?
That's right.
So if you touch the middle of their hand, their mouth will open. That's Babkin. If they grasp their hand around mom's finger, oftentimes their feet will also grasp. That's plantar. So palmar and plantar are very tied together. So babies always are putting things in their mouth. They're grabbing things and putting them in their mouth and mouthing them because the mouth has so many receptors in it. So when we think about the developing sensory system in an infant, hands, mouth, and feet, Babinski is one of those. Plantar is also called foot grasp. Palmar, I know Dr. Muscatova calls that Robinson's hands grasp. From what my research, because I was like, why is it called two different things? Those were two different researchers who found the same reflexes on two different continents. And so it just depends on who you're studying as to whether it's called Palmer or Robinson's.
Hmm.
I know somebody out there's probably going to correct me on that, but that's what I found based on my research. It's kind of like trunk extension and vomer.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same reflex, but it depends who found it and when and where. Um, so when I work with kids with significant developmental delay, like say global developmental delay or level 3 autism, I always start with hands, mouth, and feet because it's really kind of the foundation of how babies learn their environment, right? They're
Yeah.
giving lots of proprioceptive input and doing that sensory piece first before we work to motor movement helps activate the parietal lobes. Parietal lobes activate the motor cortex. And then when we get to intentional movement, then we get the prefrontal cortex involved. That's how you get more activity in the higher orders of the brain is like getting from that sensory pathway up into the motor pathway and then getting motor planning involved through like isometric movement or play-based activities if you're right. I know that's more your world. You
That
like
is.
to, right? Yeah.
No, that's
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. That's amazing. And my fun fact. Here's my fun fact for our maybe this might be our ending of our episode. Uh, when you just said hands, mouth, and feet, and how you were saying babies put things in their mouth to explore and sensory, the thing that I learned as that I didn't know that I think is so cool is that babies learn 3D vision by putting objects in their mouth. Isn't that so cool?
Say more.
That's the way that they understand the development and the structure of 3D
Oh,
is
yeah.
through putting objects in their mouth. Isn't that wild? I mean, it makes sense, but like it's
Right.
one of those. So, like in COVID, and the reason that this came up was that during COVID, people kept taking things out of kids' mouth because they were so concerned about germs and things like that. And so this like they were noticing these different changes and I was like, actually, I mean, I know you don't want germs, but like wipe it down because like that's part of their development. It's how they develop not only their sensory system but their vision and this concept that things have depth and that things have different sizes. And so like so when you said hands, mouth, and feet, and you were talking about that, Like that, isn't that so cool? Like that's how
It
you
is.
develop
Yeah.
3D vision is by putting things in your mouth. So wash your stuff. I know germs aren't great, but like you also got to let them explore in a safe way.
True. And
So,
I
yeah.
was I was just talking to somebody the other day. They have a 4-year-old level 3 autism. And they're like, the child never stops putting things in their mouth. How do we stop that? And I said, well, that's a developmental phase, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look at them. Yes, they're 4 or 5 or 7 or however old they are, but where is their brain operating?
Mm-hmm.
Chronological age is not neurological age. So if they're still at the point where everything's going in the mouth, it's because their sensory system hasn't developed enough for them to be able to experience the world beyond this infantile stage. So as we work through the reflex patterns and give lots of sensory input in very targeted ways, then that behavior just stops because they're like, oh, I can just see things and feel things, and I don't have to put everything in my mouth to experience the world.
Oh,
So
very
I know, I know we talked a lot of, we've talked about movement a lot, but one thing we didn't talk about, which I think is important, is, and then I know we've got to wrap it up here, is the order in which the body develops, like motor movement. Like that's important, I think, is people always talk about, oh, well, their handwriting's really poor, but they have poor postural control, right?
Mhm.
So we know that the body develops from the midline out, or proximal to distal is what we call it in our world, right? So midline of the body out. And the cerebellum is set up the same way. So the girdle, like, trunk, that's midline cerebellum. But then our arms and legs are like intermediate cerebellum, and our hands and feet are lateral cerebellum. So it works outward. So when we talk about kids having, issues with their gait, or like the way they hold their feet, or, obviously foot reflexes are involved there, but, or poor hand control or their handwriting. Yes, that can also be Palmer or Babkin, but are we looking at a developmental issue where we're still working on postural control? So we don't even have this really strong midline development. So how could we possibly have ease of movement and coordinated movement in our limbs and then our hands and feet? It just doesn't happen. So thinking about it that way as well, I think really helps our listeners. When you're looking at your kids, think of them kind of in more this holistic way. Like,
Yeah.
are they always slouching over? Are they always like, I have a couple kids who just, when I started working with them, they just wanted to lay on the floor. They didn't even want to sit up. They
Sure.
would just
Yeah.
lay on their side to read things.
Easier, right?
Right, right. Or, kids that I know when I was a kid, I always, because like you, I had lots of retained reflexes till I found this work about 40. Um, I would always sit, slouched in my chair with kind of my back around it
Mhm.
because my STNR was so active that the trainer that integrated it for me, she looked at me when she asked me to get in that quadruped hands and knees position, and she went, "Oh, Mary."
Yeah.
That was
Had that
big
too. Yeah.
because it was so bad.
Yeah. I get
I
it.
could not get in that position. Um, so like kind of looking at kids holistically about where are they, what are we seeing? If do they have good postural control, then we've got midline development. And then it works out from there. But sometimes when kids can't do these kind of movements that we want them to do, we kind of have to work from the inside out. But that's a conversation for an whole other topic. And I don't want to confuse people. But let's think about midline out and think about that development. And then the other thing is like gross and fine motor. So
I think
my my
I think we'll save gross and fine motor for another day, but I do think it's
okay.
important what you're saying, just to go back, is that I think again it goes to quality. So you just
Yeah.
described how are they doing their handwriting. It's not just that they can't do handwriting. You're looking at what their posture is or the quality of the activity so that you can assess and go back and help those other reflexes, because it's never just one reflex. It's never one thing. They all work together. There's multiple systems involved. Sometimes it feels like, oh, I've tried this reflex, or I've tried this thing, or I've tried this, and you feel like you've tried all the things, and maybe you're just missing one piece with that quality of movement, or that one postural piece. Like maybe you're just missing head writing. And if you get that online, the rest will domino. And now all the exercises that you did before, you can go back to, and they'll start working. Does that?
Mm. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Well, that was another robust and exciting discussion today. Angela, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I think we did great. If you want to find us, Mary, how do we find you?
If you want to join my Facebook group, it's called Reflex Integration and Brain Training. There's about 25,000 members on there, lots of practitioners on there to help answer your questions. And we focus only on reflexes, so there's no biomedical conversations or things like that. But it's a really great place to pose your questions and get thoughtful answers. And um, working on an online course for folks, but that's still a work in progress. So
Everything is, right? So
always is, yeah.
wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You can email us at brainsinmotionpodcast@gmail.com. You can find Mary at her website, brain-works.org, or on Facebook with her Facebook Reflex Integration groups. If you would like that information, please check our show notes. And you can find Angela at angelapt.com or rainbowdragonbooks.com. Thanks for listening.